Hello and welcome to Southeast Asia Talks. I'm Edwin Shri Bimo, and today we are with Putra Adhiguna. He's the managing director of the Energy Shift Institute in Indonesia. He's the expert, the perfect person who are going to share with us lessons learned from Indonesia in mining and smelting of critical minerals, particularly the hot topics are nickel. And Putra is with us now, and also with us, Obert, the Africa editor for the critical mineral for the China Global South project. Obert, hello, and Putra, hello. Today we are going to have this discussion, talks about lesson learned from each other, from Indonesia, about um, um, mining and smelting of critical minerals, and Obert also will share experience from Africa that perhaps us, the public, can learn from our cross sharing of experiences. Okay, so Obert, please, let's start.
Yeah, thanks, Edwin. Putra, I'm interested really in understanding, the landscape for nickel mining and refining in Indonesia. We hear that a lot of African countries want to emulate what the Indonesian government has done in terms of moving up the value chain by processing or refining nickel, in Indonesia, and also capture more value. Maybe if you could take us through that, understanding the landscape, who are the players, and also, the Chinese, which we know are biggest players in the sector. What is it that they are doing, and how is that working?
Yeah, hi, Obert, and thank you for having me. Hi, Edwin and Obert. So I think when we talk about nickel, let's go back in history, right, for a moment. Indonesia used to produce a lot of raw nickel and export it mostly to China. And somewhere along the way, there's a lot of government policies that try to do the mineral beneficiation, basically trying to ramp up higher in the value chain. So somewhere in the 2010s to 2015s, there is a policy of banning the raw nickel ore export. Now, at that point, what comes is that there's a lot of investment that comes. Majority is coming from China because the original destination of the ore was China. So then the natural investors actually came from China. So there has been a lot of investment coming in the smelter side, i.e. the basic processing of the nickel ore. And since then, from 2015 to about today, the production has increased by a factor of at least 7 to 8 times. So this is where there's a lot of, a lot of countries are looking at Indonesia as some kind of a role model, because in a way, Indonesia managed to get some of the investments into the Indonesian shores. Now, a bit of a background is that in the country itself owns about 40-ish% of the global nickel reserve, which means that it has a lot of leverage. At the same time, it's working with China, the leading consumer of the nickel ore, which also has a lot of technologies that can enable some of these, trying to produce and process some of these nickel. So you're literally having let's call it two matching pieces, countries trying to rise up the value chain, and then China still need the nickel, and they say, sure, why don't we build it, some smelters on the Indonesian shore? Now, one thing, however, that we need to keep in mind, that the leverage comes from the reserves ownership. Without having significant ownership of the reserves for specific kind of commodities, for example, in our case, it's nickel, it's going to be a very tough deal, because we're actually trying to do this in multiple other minerals. So we're trying to do this right now with aluminum. We're trying to do this in other kinds of metal as well. And the degree of the success will be very different, right? Because if you're a consumer of, for example, aluminum, and let's say Indonesia produced 10% or less than 10% of the global aluminum, when you try to implement that nickel model in other kinds of metal, people may not get into the same story. So I guess the first question has always been, how big is a leverage does your country have in terms of reserve? Does the buyer has a plan B? Because if they do have a plan B, they will not necessarily want to invest in your country. Now, one other thing is that we did give a lot of red carpets. We did a lot of tax breaks, all the to attract all the investors, we give all kinds of incentives. And this is where I guess where a lot of people start to question about the cost benefit side, because people will start asking questions: what are you giving away and what are you getting in return? And frankly, up until today, like 10 years later, I really haven't seen who's actually have done these proper cost benefits, because we also need to consider sometimes these incentives may be formal, i.e. fiscal incentives. Other times it can be loose environmental regulations. How do you quantify a loose environmental regulation, right? So I think that's, I guess, that's the landscape of what we have in Indonesia. So whenever people look at it as a role model, just start with those 2 points. Number one is how big of a leverage does your country has, and then what kind of cost benefits that you can actually need to do before you actually go into that route.
Yeah, I think you raise very important points about leverage. If a country doesn't have significant reserves, obviously they cannot control that value chain or compel one of the biggest buyers of that particular resource to invest in value addition or beneficiation of it, which I think while a lot of people want to believe that African countries have a lot of leverage, where we see things from, we think not many African countries have leverage when it comes to these critical minerals. Obviously, there are exceptions, like in the cobalt, for instance. We know DRC as the leverage. Zimbabwe, on the other hand, doesn't have much leverage when it comes to lithium. Because China can source lithium from the South America, lithium triangle from Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina, or even from Australia. But increasingly, we are seeing that even without much leverage, when the government of Zimbabwe did limit, or rather, it was similar ban to what happened in Indonesia. In 2022, our government also limited the export of unprocessed lithium. Even without much leverage, we saw a lot of Chinese companies complying in terms of setting up, processing facilities. But the processing is not very, sophisticated in a sense. It's simply low-level beneficiation or value addition, where they're crushing ore into production of lithium concentrate. So we are seeing countries like even Namibia, Mali, Ghana, also trying to do the same with limiting export, compelling companies to move up the value chain. But if these countries really have leverage, I think not many of them do have leverage. But I want to learn more in terms of, now that you explained the landscape, and that a lot of Chinese companies in Indonesia are in the processing facilities, processing of or refining of the nickel. How does that landscape look like in terms of control and ownership? I read a piece, I think just last week, that was indicating that because of some of the governance challenges within Indonesia, China still does have a lot of control of the nickel value chain, not only the refining of this value chain, this resource, but also even really the entire processing, the refining, and I think production of some products that come out of it for export to China. So could you talk to us about that a little bit?
Yeah, thanks, Obert. So I guess it's easier for us to actually go from the mines and then progressively move forward, right? So I think the mine ownership is quite mixed. There's a lot of domestic ownership mixed with some, let's call it the usual international companies, as well as there's some Chinese ownership here and there. Bearing in mind that some ownership may not be transparent, right, in some of these mines. But then as you move into the basic smelting, and I use the word basic there, to explain, just like your point, right? There's a lot of these process or basic processing is nearly all, I think, within 80 to 90% are basically Chinese ownership. So in terms of control, China has a very strong control in producing the basic products of nickel. such as the nickel pig irons or other kinds of basic processing. And then you got nothing else. And that's the problem, right? And then you probably have some level of additional processing, like for the battery factories. You have this intermediate products, right? They call it the MHPs and whatnot. But really, on a whole value chain, on a scale of 0 to 100, that's probably like 20%, right? So between the 20% up until the electric vehicles, there's practically very limited investment so far. Then what happened is really, let me go to electric vehicles. Now, as we know that nickel is still, the majority of nickel consumption globally is still for stainless steel, roughly 70%. So only about 20 to 30% actually goes to batteries and whatnot. But there's a lot of stories that are being peddled that, the nickel is for the EVs and whatnot. But the reality, that's not happening. So coming back to your point, I think the similar pattern emerges is that the kind of investment that is happening on the ground is still limited. The majority of it is still basic smelting, basic processing. There has been some good news, let's call it that way, of big companies such as CATL want to build some kind of a supply chain for battery factories. And I think that's still a positive news, hopefully, if we can get that realized. But in terms of a wider, if we zoom out a little bit, let's say you have 100 ton of nickel, but then you're going to produce 5 ton of that going to goes to battery factories. What's the other 95 ton going to goes to, right? I think we need to kind of put that into perspective because people tend to get too quickly to be excited about there's a new battery factories. It's positive, it's great, but in the bigger scale of things, there's also big question marks. What is the other nickel is going to do, right? So I think that pattern is emerging in places like Indonesia. Now, you brought an interesting point about countries with limited leverage that manage to attract things. I think we need to keep in mind several things, right? Like we have the same pattern in Indonesia's aluminum. Indonesia's aluminum is very small, but once the government limited the export, we still see Chinese investors coming in. Not to the massive degree like we see in nickel, but building 1, 2 to 3 factories. It started to comes in. I guess it's also a part and parcel of this is probably China's strategic views of the future, right? So I think it's not surprising that they want to be out there. So,
Putra, maybe you can share with Africa the kind of regulations that the basics, the fundamentals of the regulations in terms of business-wise, investment-wise, and ESG-wise. What does Africa needs to prepare in terms of this so that these operations from mining to smelter can go in line with the today's world demands of the ESG?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Edwin. I guess early on, African countries need to look at what their neighbors are doing, what are the major producers are already doing. That's firstly. And secondly, look at what key destination markets are doing for their products, right? For example, if you have specific kind of critical minerals that is destined for markets like East Asian countries, as well as European countries, you need to be ready for the regulation that kind of comes from Europe as well as other countries. I think anticipating the future will be important because we're seeing the pattern even from Chinese, battery companies. They are becoming more sensitive toward these. For example, Europe has a battery regulation, for example, right? If you're a major electric vehicle producer, you want to make sure that you can sell your product in Europe. And you want to make sure everybody within your value chain can actually do that. So it's really about anticipating the future. Is it going to be easy? Frankly, not, because Indonesia is actually a test case for that. I know people like to talk about green nickel, but nobody wants to pay for the green nickel, right? So we have the usual controversy where people like to say the nice things, but once it comes to the, how much premium are you willing to pay, then we started seeing some problems. So at the end of the day, regulation will still play a very big, important role in having your products being accepted globally. It may take time, but those who are on the leading edge on having higher standards will definitely have more access on a wider market.
Yes. So my question was going to be on the DRC's export ban on cobalt, which we saw a couple of months back, and that has been extended. And now we hear also of some Chinese companies that are trying to enter into the Indonesia cobalt space. If you could maybe talk to us about that, does this potentially mean that we are likely to see Indonesia also filling up that space? And how much does Indonesia have in terms of cobalt reserves?
Yeah, Indonesia rose from practically nothing to the world's second largest cobalt exporter. And a lot of people doesn't even pay attention to that. So today, Indonesia is the second largest cobalt producer. Of course, it's by far behind DRC, but it still provides an alternative supply within the value chain, right? So I wouldn't be surprised that as policy evolve in places like DRC, a lot of buyers will try to find other alternatives. And I think Indonesia, which has already started building up its supply within the last 5 years, will be the natural path for them to try to find it. I don't think we'll be able to overtake DRC supply anytime soon, but that movement will definitely be there.
Indeed, and DRC is one such country that has leverage when it comes to the cobalt, supply chain. Which I think they're trying to use with this policy to control the commodity fluctuations and volatility that we have seen on pricing. But I want to come back to the issue of nickel. The Chinese government are now raising questions about the export of products coming out of the Indonesia from nickel processing, and allegedly there is some dumping that is happening. I see it's surprising that we have a lot of the Chinese companies that are the ones exporting to China, and Chinese government raising issues that wait a minute, we are going to tariff the increase of steel products, if you could correct me there, coming out of Indonesia. And I foresee a similar situation happening for a country like Zimbabwe, where literally the entire lithium value chain is controlled by Chinese, from mining to processing of the lithium. And we have much of our exports of this product going to China. I'm interested in also getting your thoughts about that, how China is now using, tariff to limit the export from Indonesia.
Yeah, that's an interesting topic, isn't it? Because I think whenever people hear the word China, they tend to see a monolith of China. Well, in reality, you've got all these different companies competing between each other. It's a bloodbath out there, right? I mean, you have Chinese companies that go abroad, and you've got Chinese companies that doesn't go abroad. So I think you're going to have a lot of competition in that. So to your question, I think when Indonesia opened the floodgate of Chinese investors, because it's mostly Chinese investors in the smelters, it essentially give access to multiple things. Number one, it created a captive market for the nickel, because the nickel producer cannot sell it elsewhere. Number two, it has a good access to cheap coal, because Indonesia is the world's biggest coal exporter. And then you got all kinds of incentives on the ground, right? Tax incentives, loose environmental regulations, and all these things. At the same time, China is trying to impose things like emission control. High energy intensity products need to have better control and whatnot. So you're seeing this dynamics, let's call it a tension, right, between those who are trying to go abroad, provide a supply. At the same time, if you're producing a nickel, an NPI in China, it's going to be less competitive than producing it in Indonesia, because you need to haul all kinds of products there. So I wouldn't be surprised that similar things will happen elsewhere. I guess it's also a reminder that the Indonesian story has a lot of lessons that can be taken, right, by others that are trying to do this. And also not to treat China as like a single entity, because you're seeing all these competitions and frictions between Chinese companies. So yeah, it'll be an interesting space to watch. And I wouldn't be surprised that, at the end of the day, China also want their domestic production to grow, especially with their existing Chinese economy challenges. They also want, quite a lot of activities happening on the ground. So I think they're trying to balance that out. It's not an easy balancing, because at the same time, as we know, technology also changes. So you got all kinds of dynamics coming into play as well. So.
Interesting. And you talked about, that the Indonesian story has a lot of lessons. And what are some of the lessons that you think other countries like in Africa that we should learn? If you could blow by blow, what are those lessons and things not to do or not to copy from Indonesia?
Okay, so firstly, that's a tough question, Obert, because like I said, I haven't seen a cost-benefit analysis of what we're doing. Number one is that be careful of what you are being promised and what you're promising to your people. In Indonesia, we started the nickel downstreaming with a promise.
As a government.
Correct, right. As a government, there's a lot of stories saying that we're going to have an electric vehicle factories. 10 years later, we barely have anything. Right. So I think be careful on what is being promised to you and what you're promising to your people, because this big narrative shapes the public perception. And, it's so easy for, people to start by having lithium, we're going to have an EV factory. Well, wait a minute. Can we actually look at Indonesia or look at other countries and try to do a proper analysis or proper planning? What exactly are we going to get in return of this? Right. So I think that is going to be a first important part. Secondly, it's still an important part to be able to attract investment, right? Again, it comes back to your first question, is that how do you do the cost benefits and all this? I'm mindful that there is no easy answer to this because usually government with their 5-year cycle of democracies and whatnot, they just tend to look at, can we get the investment as soon as possible? It's not easy. So, but again, having a cost benefit analysis that is transparent and can be held accountable is important, because don't promise your people you're going to have EV factories if maybe you can only get 20% of those, right? Because people will have more information then. Now, in terms of social and environmental standards, a lot of people tend to dismiss this discussion of transition minerals because they've seen the challenges in mining. I know all of us in here are very familiar that some people tend to say, well, it's mining. Right? Mining has always been like this, and it's going to be very difficult to change it. I'm slightly more optimistic with the sense that within a world that is transitioning, a lot of the products do end up in greener products. And greener products tend to be sold in countries, markets that have more demanding requirements. So it's not the same to sell that I'm selling steel, for example, then I'm selling this mineral that will be used for a green product. So I'm still hopeful that the green pressure will eventually land into all these value chains and minings and whatnot. And that comes back to the point that I discussed briefly with Edwin, is that make sure that you know what is your target market requiring. If you want your market to have an access to Europe, then you better start being ready today, right? You don't want to be behind in the game. You can always try to pick the easiest way, running things without environmental standard. But look what happened in Indonesia. Literally every 2 weeks, you will see some nickel bashing article, from anywhere, right? I don't know if that's productive, but that's going to happen in any case. So I guess the point is that if you are going to do what we're doing, make sure you got a proper cost benefit analysis, make sure you have your product ready for the future, because the future will demand higher standards.
Yeah, I think talking of ESG standards, I think in Zimbabwe we already have a lot of communities in areas where lithium is being mined, complaining about cases of pollution, environmental degradation, etc. And government is also trying to come in and close those gaps by trying to hold companies. But whether that is effective, that's another discussion. But we are literally seeing the same things on the ESG side, and communities demanding more and higher standards. But I wanted to come back to some of the what we call the key ingredients for moving up the value chain. Of course, governance is a big part of it. Having a proper governance, transparency mechanisms. But one of the challenges for Zimbabwe, for lithium, I think this is peculiar to lithium, is that lithium, it could also apply maybe to other minerals. Lithium in Zimbabwe is found in dry regions. So these are already water-strained areas. And government, when they say they want it processed, the process of actually, floating it and coming up with, concentrate or sulfate is very water intensive. And these facilities are, concentrated in areas where already there isn't enough, rainfall. So there are also concerns from the communities on the impact on water resources access because of the competition now by mining companies. Then the other thing is energy, power to run these facilities, which in Zimbabwe again is a major challenge. We have, I think, on a day, you have 8 hours, 10 hours, load shedding, which again affects companies. So when you speak to Chinese companies and ask them what are some of the challenges that they are facing in moving up the value chain, they bring up this question of energy, that Zimbabwe doesn't have a reliable energy source to help us move up the value chain. And government wants companies now to set up their own independent, power plants to supply their processing facilities, which I think when you talk of cost benefit analysis, one would say, well, why should we invest so much in getting all these things together when we can literally go to the lithium triangle and get the lithium without these requirements? So in the case of Indonesia, I also wanted to find out in terms of when government started to demand companies to refine and smelt the nickel in Indonesia, with besides the financial incentives, when you talk of the energy factor, what was done, if there's anything that was done to address if there was any energy concerns?
Yeah, the energy question is actually quite sensitive to many people because what the Chinese smelters basically did is they just built coal plants everywhere. Nearly 100% of Indonesia's smelters are basically coal powered. And because Indonesia is the world's biggest coal exporter, it has no issues in doing that, right? So unfortunately, whether we like it or not, at the time that we're trying to build all these facilities, there is not really that much of a pressure to adopt green energy. The focus is really build something fast, build the coal, anything goes. So we had that, well, let's call it a luxury, right? A bad luxury of having the coal power produced domestically. And I think this challenge will be quite different across many regions. Some regions will try to use hydro, for example, to get things greener, but hydro will take time to be built, right? And I think there's a lot of anticipation that needs to be done as well. So I don't have a clear-cut answers about energy because, like you said, places like Zimbabwe, places like Chile, each of them has very different amount of energy, type of resources, the process of extracting, like you said, right? I mean, having a water strain area try to produce lithium there by evaporation is not an easy process. So I think I don't really think so. I guess this is something else that we also need to keep in mind is that be also careful about the lifetime of the growth spurt that may be happening. So right now, let me give you an example. There are people that estimate Indonesia's nickel will run out in the next 10 years. So, I mean, with all the noises that may come, there is a potential. Let me give you an example. What if within the next 3 to 4 years, sodium-ion battery kicks off, right? And then you're going to have the lithium being displaced by sodium. So we got all this, moving puzzles happening at the same time. When Indonesia started the nickel journey, nobody talks about an LFP iron-based batteries. Now, 75% of EV in China doesn't use nickel. So we're seeing all these changes in technologies and resources. It is very also important that any countries, whether it's Asia, Africa, Latin America, can try to use this as a ride to wave, but they also need to keep in mind that basing your development solely on the resources alone may not have that long of a lifetime, right? Even if you build factories, technology may change, right? Even like right now, suppose we have a nickel smelting, but if the nickel runs out or the ore quality depletes in the next 7 to 10 years, people will move on and they can even move on to other kinds of technologies.
Yeah. I think we're already seeing that the sodium-ion batteries are already replacing lithium. So I think that's very important because research and development that is happening every day is bringing new technologies that will replace the minerals we are talking about today. which is why perhaps also, I think governments need to also invest in think tanks, in research centers, to undertake forward-looking 10 years time, to say what are some of the minerals that we need in 20 years to come that no one is talking about today. I think that's the bigger question also, which obviously we can't address that today. But I think I've learned quite a lot. I really appreciate the time. And
Okay. Putra, what do you think about this part? The need for public monitoring and oversight for these operations in Indonesia's experience, and what does Africa needs to? What can Indonesia share from Indonesia's experience about public oversight to Africa when they have planned to for this mining and smelting?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Edwin. And that's why I highlighted earlier that transparent cost benefit will be very important, because without a public oversight, nobody knows what you're giving away and what you're going to get in return. So today, like in Indonesia, the industrial facilities can often feel like a wild west. People will tend to, who's responsible to, for example, for the wastewater, and people just, tend to point their fingers in different directions. So to that end is that really, once industrial development kicks off, sometimes the train is moving too fast. So you may want to be sure that you have a strong oversight early on, i.e. set the rule of the game. Sure, let's invest in Africa, let's invest in Indonesia, but set what are the rule of the game, right? And I don't think in Indonesia we had that. It's really open the door, here's the red carpet, anybody want to invest, and then we'll figure it out later. That's practically what happened in Indonesia. And that's now how I'd like to call it, is that we open a floodgate. And now when the floodgate is open, it's very hard to rein it in. Now, I'm mindful that people are competing among countries, but it's something that can be tried, right? Especially like in Africa. Of course, again, this is a very, a very abstract concept, but between African countries, there also need to be some kind of a cooperation, coordination at least, to kind of like, let's set the bar, how I'd like to call it in this way. So you got all the Western standards at this point, and you have zero standard at this point, right? You don't want to be there, right? You want to be somewhere in between. And I think that point is doable. It may be difficult to meet all the European standards, but we should never allow investment to come in without strong oversight, right? We want to find that middle ground in between.
Right. Thank you. Oh, last time, anything you want to add in terms of experience that can be shared from Indonesia to Zimbabwe, perhaps, because this is obviously a very important.
Yeah. Thanks, Edwin. So picking up into Obert's point about research, I think that's actually important, right? One of the nickel companies actually sponsored a small research lab somewhere in Indonesia's university. I guess my point is that any companies that invest in your country will need to have some kind of research body embedded within your country. And by that, I meant that I really suggest that such research body is not purely academic, but very strongly linked into industries, right? Because as we know that if you're running a pure academic research, the train would have moved on by the time you finish your thesis. Let's call it that way, right? Because academic research tend to move very slowly. So having some research capacity on the ground is important, and they need to be embedded with the latest technology. They need to be strongly intertwined with China, other regions, and all these things, as opposed to being purely academic, because that's going to be important for the policymaker to make decisions as well. Because otherwise, the policymaker may think that the technology goes static while China already moved on into a completely different direction.
Yeah, also we'll share the name of the company that has invested in research in Indonesia.
I can share you the link afterward. I can't remember, but it's actually built a small research center at a university called ITB, Institute Technology Bandung.
Yeah. One last issue. I believe this happens everywhere. Job creation. What do you think that Indonesia can share about preparing the human resources, the job for job creation in here, that Indonesia can share from its experience to Zimbabwe. Because at the end of the day, everything for the host country, apart from all the revenues, is job creation. Please, Putra.
Yeah, job creation is a big deal, as we know. Like in Indonesia, the nickel sector created like hundreds of thousands of jobs, right? So despite all the bad news, they did create quite a lot of jobs. It is very, I think we need to acknowledge that Chinese presence in the country, the host country, will be inevitable because a lot of technologies will take time to move on and so forth. We will need some technical support coming from China and other countries. But I think in terms of job creation, we need to look longer than the lifetime of the smelters. Right? I think that's put it simply, right? I.e., when you do have a plan for investment, for example, in region A, you want to make sure that there is an establishment of training institutions, a longer term outlook of what the job creation would look like. Because what we don't want to happen is that, sure, you create 50,000 jobs, but then what's going to happen after that, right? Because like I mentioned earlier, the jobs may only last 7 years. What's going to happen after? So I think we need to be very careful and also try to treat this industries in a way somewhat similar to mining, because if it's resource-based, it will have a lifetime. Therefore, when you do have the opportunity to build skills, make sure you have training programs, establish institutions, closer to the ground, so that you're training people at the same time you're training them for what's going to come after. That's a bit of an abstracted answer, but that's my worry, is that if we're seeing a big spike in jobs and then it's going to be a rapid decline, and suddenly Indonesia lost 200,000 jobs in the next 15 years, that's going to be a lot of people. So.
Yeah, and that needs to be anticipated as well, not only in Indonesia and Asia, but also in Africa, preparing the manpower with the skill to jump into the job, and also anticipate when everything ends in that sector. Listeners, that's Putra Adhiguna from the Managing Director of the Energy Shift Institute, and Obert, the Africa Critical Mineral Editor, sharing experience and lessons learned from Indonesia to Zimbabwe and vice versa. That's it for now from us. We will see you later for another topic. Thank you very much, Putra and Obert. We will see you next time.